what I'm going to talk about is the issue of what we can do to improve food packaging regulation in Europe. And basically, I'll take you through it. It's quite a brief presentation. But the first thing I'm going to do is to make sure you understand the basics of what the EU does already to regulate chemicals. Because really you need that to understand what actually happens on food packaging. And the key law there is REACH, which most of you will probably have heard of. But I'm going to try and introduce it in a slightly different way. And then looking at the chemicals in packaging laws in Europe and the way they are actually very inadequate. There's a lot of focus in this meeting on plastics, but the reality is actually everything else is much worse than the plastics regulation. And then we've got an opportunity. We have a review, and we've been working with other NGOs to establish 5 principles for that review, and then some next steps. So firstly, I'm just going to say, I'm just going to say something about ChemTrust. So we're a charity. We work at EU level, UK level, and also in Germany, and do some global work on protecting humans and wildlife from harmful chemicals. We're really focused on the identification of and action on hormone-disrupting chemicals. And we work with scientists, we work with technical processes, decision makers, and we work a lot with other civil society groups, particularly at European level. And we have a blog which explains our key work. So if you look at the EU and chemical regulation, so the EU market is more than 500 million consumers. So it's actually a very big market because obviously they're quite affluent consumers. So China or India are bigger countries, but they have less money, I suppose, basically, at this point. So this is a big market, so there's a lot of wish to sell to it, and you have a very standardised product regulation system in Europe. You have the internal market, which basically enables something approved in one country to be sold across, and it's actually a stronger internal market in some ways than the US one is. The rules for this market are agreed by member state governments and members of the European Parliament. That's the 2 pillars of European decision-making, based on a draft from the European Commission. So you get the Commission, which is the civil service, the executive, creates the draft legislation, and then it's passed by these 2 democratic pillars, governments and Parliament. You get detailed implementation happening where you have Commission and member state experts. So you keep the democracy in there, but you don't tend to have actual MEPs, the members of the European Parliament, involved at that level. And Europe has pretty comprehensive chemical-related laws, but there are some gaps. And the most important law is REACH, which is the regulation of general industrial chemicals. It's been going for 12 years or so now. It was very, very controversial when it was created. There was huge amounts of lobbying against it, particularly from the US government and US companies. But also there's laws on pesticides and biocides, cosmetics, food contact materials. And I think one thing that's important to talk about is there's also a whole set of laws on industrial emissions. So when you're dealing with factory emissions, in Europe there's a principle called best available techniques. So you have a very, very elaborate process of producing very, very long documents, headquartered at a place called Sevilla in Spain, which say, this is the sort of technologies you should be using at a minimum as a company on your emissions. So there's quite strong regulation of factory pollution in the EU. So if we go forward to REACH. Okay, so what I decided to do was to try and do REACH in one slide. So firstly, look at the top. You've got a section which is down to the industry. This is things that industry does by itself. It's following legislation in theory, but it's not being checked on what it does. And then there's a whole load of things that are done by the regulators, which is ECHA, which is the European Chemical Agency based in Helsinki, EU governments, and that regulatory process. And it's important to realise that the REACH has both sides of this system. So on the industry side, you have your producers, importers of chemicals, and if their chemical is coming into Europe or being produced at over a tonne a year, they have to deliver a registration to the chemical regulation system. If it's a low tonnage chemical, 1 to 10 tonnes, there isn't much information in that registration, but they do have to do it. At the same time, they also have to be producing safety data sheets, which go down to their downstream users, and they have to be self-classifying their chemical. And one of the things that REACH does is rather than just having companies classifying chemicals and putting it down to their downstream users, there is actually an inventory. So you can go online and you can see how companies are self-classifying. And sometimes they form groups to do a single registration and a single self-classification. Sometimes there's other companies who are actually outside and they have a different classification, because often those self-classifications are very poor. They tend to say it's all fine, it's all completely safe. Sometimes you can have one block of companies who are saying it's completely safe, and one company says, actually, we don't think it is, which is interesting, but a mess. So this is the industry side. Then you go, basically the registration dossier comes into the REACH system, and the first thing that happens is an automated completeness check, and that only checks that all the boxes are filled in with sensible information, like a number where it's supposed to be a number. So it doesn't do very much. And then it goes into the registration database. So you get this registration database which has a huge number of registrations in it, covering about 22,000, I think, chemicals now. So that stuff just sits in that database. It's available. Some information is available to the public on that. It's a bit limited. And then what happens is you get some of the registrations are then checked to see if they're okay. And the law actually says that 5% need to be checked. And that was one of those figures that was pulled out of the air, really. And what's interesting is because it's turned out that actually a lot of those dossiers are very poor quality, that is just being changed now to 20%. So that's something. And this, again, now we're into the regulator thing. So these are checks that happen at the chemical agency. So this is your basic database. And then you say, right, so what do you do with this database? And the key thing that's done is something called evaluation, substance evaluation. And this is where there's a prioritization process which can bring in information from anywhere. So they actually, if someone in the US has done some research on high-throughput screening for some chemicals, they are dragging that information into their prioritization system in ECHA. And they say, right, these are the chemicals we want to look at, and we'll start these substance evaluations. And when a substance gets into substance evaluation, this is usually led by a member state, one of the governments. So Norway led a lot of work on perfluorinators, even though they're in the EEA rather than the EU, they're still very much involved in the process. And then they can bring in external research. So they're not dependent on what's in the dossier from industry. Although obviously the better that is, the easier their job is. And then they evaluate and they decide what do we need to do about this substance. And also in that process they can say, well, actually, we think that it looks a bit concerning, so we want some more safety data. So they can ask for more safety data, but it's quite elaborate because the industry can then appeal against it, and this is what happens in the case of deca-bromo-diphenyl ethane, which is something very like deca-PDBE, but it's slightly different. And the industry said, oh no, we don't think we should supply safety data. They appealed, and fortunately the appeal was overturned, and they have got to provide that data.
And for triclosan, they did the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, basically, you see the same games here as anywhere else, and the industry is using any process that's available to delay things. So what happens after evaluation if you actually got enough data? The first important one is the idea of restriction. And the key test here is you've got to have a risk that is not adequately controlled. And this is why, for example, in the case of microplastics, if the EU does establish legally that the risk of microplastics is not adequately controlled, then this is very, very powerful, because restrictions is a very, very powerful process because it affects presence of chemicals in import. In theory, it can actually ban production of chemicals, but it's a very flexible process. EU tends to be ban on all or some uses, and it often has exemptions as well. So it's not perfect, but it can be very powerful. So that's a fairly straightforward thing. The next thing that REACH introduced was a new sort of process, and this was partly as a result of NGO pressure, and that was this idea of authorization. And substances are very high concern. So it's the idea that there are properties which are really problematic, and often they're non-threshold or something, and so you say, right, so let's say if something is a carcinogen, a mutagen, a reproductive toxin, and then you use this phrase, or equivalent concern. You also have very persistent, very bioaccumulative, persistent bioaccumulative and toxic, and endocrine disruption. And so this substance of very high concern process, there's a process to define whether a chemical should be on that list, and quite elaborate process. And then once it's on that list, it's described as being on the candidate list. And this is the first box I have here. And what's really interesting about that is that various companies, partly in response to campaigning in the US, now have positions where they say we won't use chemicals that are SVHCs that are on that candidate list. It also means that in Europe you can ask, does this product I'm buying contain an SVHC? And they have an obligation to tell you. They usually don't know, the retailer, for example, but there's a really big, huge program going forward now. We're developing an app which is going to work across Europe, where people can just scan a barcode, and this has already existed in Germany, but this is being expanded. Scan the barcode, and then it goes to a database held by the organizer of the app, which sees if anyone's answered that question before as to whether there's an SVHC. And if not, then it automatically creates a query to go to the company. And what's interesting is that in the original system, IKEA, for example, had just downloaded all their data into their database, because IKEA do know the answers to these questions. But it's quite a powerful little thing. I can't remember how many chemicals are in there, but it's a few hundred now. And then you have another prioritization process. And then once it gets through that, you get through to the proper authorization process. And that's where basically there is a declaration that all uses of this chemical must cease by X date unless you apply to us to continue use. So whilst with restriction, the regulator needs to know what the uses are somehow and say we're going to ban these uses. In authorization, the industry has to come forward and say these are the uses we want to carry on. And then you have a process where if the industry says we want to carry on using it, there's supposed to be a test against whether there's safe alternatives. So it's quite a powerful process, but it gets confusing because it doesn't apply to imported goods, for example. And then finally, it's worth mentioning, there's then a harmonised classification and labelling system where the regulator says, well, we think this is a carcinogen. And what's significant there is there's a whole load of EU laws which actually apply then automatically or semi-automatically to restrict the use of those chemicals. And just as some examples of what has been restricted in REACH, we've got 4 phthalates, which was restricted. And what's interesting about that is they actually assume additivity between those 4 phthalates, so the limit is for some of them. Exempts a few things like food contact materials. Bisphenol A in thermal paper, but not yet bisphenol S. And we have a report that we produced a year ago. I've got one copy of the full report and a few briefings, and that really says why you need to be worried about all the bisphenols. We've got PFOA and its salts, and these are the actual implementation dates from which these things are banned. 33 CMR chemicals in textiles. And then there's various ones that are underway at the moment. One is microplastics, which has already been discussed. The CMRs in tattoo inks. And there's a whole load of different ones to do with PFAS. So REACH, it's not perfect. You have the poor quality data I've mentioned. There's a lack of data on neurological impacts, and we've also produced this no-brainer report which covers neurology. And so, it's too slow. It's easy for industry to take delays, mixtures, exemptions. It's sort of, these are all things that are priorities for EU NGOs in terms of getting REACH working better. If we move on to food contact, we have separate laws covering food contact materials. The main law has just got this overall safety phrase, do not transfer constituents to food in quantities which would endanger human health, which is a bit of a mess. Some plastics, for example, have a positive list of chemicals, which are approved by the regulator, but not paper, card, inks, glues, coatings. You do have some national laws, Germany, for example. You get regulation of recycling for plastic, but not for paper, for example. And there's no direct link to REACH. Something could be an SVHC in REACH and nothing. And you have this law, REACH came in basically at the same time as the food contact law. And the food contact law has never been reviewed until now. So we have this really big opportunity looking at the law and what we could do. And there's a separate thing looking at how endocrine disruptors are regulated across the EU system. We've got a new Commission and Parliament starting this year, and we're really pushing them that we need this new law. And we've worked together to produce 5 principles for this law. I won't go into them in too much detail, but they're high level of protection on human health, thorough assessment of chemicals and materials and final articles, effective enforcement, as Jane was mentioning, a clean circular economy based on non-toxic material cycles, and transparency and participation. And we're pushing those 5 principles that were agreed a few months ago. And what happens next? We are wanting to increase the profile of this issue at EU level. We're doing stuff with the Commission and Parliament, and we're working with HEAL, for example, and Natasha's here from HEAL. We're doing publicity and direct lobbying. We're pushing for a rapid drafting of a new law that is much more integrated with REACH. The legislative process is going to be about 2 to 4 years once it's started, and it isn't started yet. At the moment, it's just a review. We need to get them to actually commit. And this new MEPs and the Commission that comes in a few months are going to be in place for 5 years. And support is welcome, because one of the things we need, as part of this effort to make it a higher profile issue is obviously the more we know about the problems, the better. And obviously once we get to the detail of the law, then there'll be all sorts of lessons to be learned potentially from other places as well. And I've just got some useful links. So ChemTrust's website, we have a food contact page. There's a page of the actual EU review. This is the page where you link to information on chemicals on REACH, and you can try any chemical and see what you find out. And that's Food Packaging Forum. I thought I'd put them in as well. So thank you.